Simply put, when it comes to relational organizing, campaigns need to just do more of it.
Welcome to the Campaign Trend Podcast, where you're joining in on a conversation with the entrepreneurs, operatives, and experts who make professional politics happen. I'm your host, Eric Wilson. On this episode, we're breaking down some of the key findings from the Center for Campaign Innovation's 2024 post-election survey. We're joined by David Kanevsky of 3D Strategic Research, who has been conducting this poll since 2020 to share additional insights from this research and helping us understand what they mean for campaigners. If you'd like to see more numbers and charts, there's a link in our show notes to everything that we're talking about. All right, so David, let's get right into it. So first is something that we've been tracking since 2020, and that's the decline of local TV news viewership. We saw this year that just a third, 35% of voters said they watch local TV news every day to get information about current events. That's a 21-point drop from 2020. What's shaping this trend, and what does it mean for campaigners?
So what's causing this drop in local news is really about the growing media fragmentation that's been happening for a while. First, it was shifting from broadcast news to cable news, and now from cable news to the internet. While some people have called 2024 the podcast election, I really think podcasts are a symptom of a larger media fragmentation. Local news used to be the place the public turned to for weather, traffic, or sports updates. And then they'd also get some updates about what's happening around the country and in their community. Now people can get those individual pieces of information through apps on their phone. So you have a decline in this common meeting space and a rise in alternative news sources.
That's a really important part, like that unbundling of news. So it used to be, if you wanted to get your sports scores and your weather, you had to watch the local TV news and then you'd learn about candidates. And that's not happening anymore.
Exactly. And then the rise in alternative news is a bipartisan phenomena. You can see examples, not just conservatives leaving Facebook for Parler and Truth Social, or switching from Fox News to OANN and Newsmax. But even this cycle, you saw liberals leaving Twitter for Blue Sky, or canceling their Washington Post subscriptions because they disagreed with the Post non-endorsement in the presidential race. And that's why our survey now shows social media as the top daily news source among voters. People can customize their own news feeds.
I want to underline that for our listeners. So we found this year that social media is now the top daily news source among voters.
Correct. Yeah, 37% get their news on a daily basis from social media.
So watch out, communications directors, digital directors are coming for your job.
And not only from an earned media perspective, it actually has big implications around paid media too. Campaigns often prioritize buying ads around local news because those viewers are seen as highly engaged audiences who are more likely to vote, and people who generally watch the news live, so they aren't skipping ads. But if voters aren't watching local news as much, then campaigns may not need to buy local news ad adjacencies as much. So a lot of GOP gains this year came with lower propensity voters. And in our survey, it was matched to the voter file. So we're able to look at among people who didn't vote in both 2020 and 2022, they're even less likely to watch local news. And you see some campaigns are starting to adjust. For example, Dave McCormick's Senate campaign, they did a postmortem where they discussed how they deprioritized ads on local news because the low propensity voters they needed aren't watching their local news.
Yeah. And this is, again, it's a double whammy for campaigns. We're losing the eyeballs in terms of earned, of campaigns being able to get their message out to voters, but we're also losing the eyeballs in terms of paid media. And it really is a big shift. And a lot of other surveys from this past year have shown just that there's sort of a big divide in news consumers versus non-news consumers. And I was really surprised in our survey that we found that 1 in 4 voters, so not adults, but voters, don't engage with news and current events. That includes 7% who said they actively avoid the news, which is just crazy to me. And so, Dave, you obviously mentioned that, more voters are getting their news each day from social media. And we saw this year, most notably, that TikTok has overtaken X, formerly Twitter, in the number 4 spot of daily usage by voters. It really shot up. Back in 2020, TikTok's daily usage was just 7%. And in 2024, it's now 18%, again, among voters. So what else do we know about the TikTok audience?
First, TikTok's usage is growing both as more younger voters enter the electorate, but also as older voters start using it more. For example, among voters aged 35 to 49, so your kind of elder millennials, just 3% were using TikTok daily in 2020. but now 26% are. And among voters age 18 to 34, 26% used TikTok daily in 2020, but now 41% are using it daily. And if TikTok isn't banned, its share is going to grow in future electorates. As Pew Research just released a survey that showed among teens age 13 to 17, 63% of them use TikTok.
Yeah, this is going to be a major moonshot, I think, for Republicans if TikTok does, as President Trump wants, to keep it around. If it survives this ban, we're going to have to figure out how to engage there.
I went back and actually found some old Pew Research data. Back in 2008, they showed that 22% of adults had a Facebook profile. That was 2 years after Facebook opened to being accessible by the general public. So already in 2024, we're seeing more voters use TikTok daily than were on Facebook in 2008. And if we kind of go from 2008 to 2012, 67% of adults used Facebook according to Pew Research. So while I understand the concerns around TikTok's ownership, it would be the equivalent of campaigns not being active on Facebook in 2008 heading into 2012.
Wow. Okay. and the campaigns that did that or didn't do that, rather, didn't win.
Yeah. There's also an assumption that because TikTok viewers are younger, that they lean Democratic and Republicans don't need to be there. And that's not entirely true. First, twice as many younger Republicans under the age of 50 use TikTok daily as watch Fox News daily. And then among voters who use TikTok at least once a week, their party ID, when you include leaners, is they're Democratic by 11 points. So 50% are Democrats, 39% are Republican. And we also asked across all social media platforms, but specifically among TikTok, did they see more content from Democrats or from Republicans? And they said they saw more content from Democrats by a 17-point margin. But then when we look at the ballot, Trump only lost these weekly TikTok users by 6%, 46 to 52. So he outperformed party ID. He outperformed what they were seeing in the overall media ecosystem. And that's in large part because Trump made a play for voters on TikTok, cutting those videos with Jake Paul and others. And it helped him cut into an audience that leans Democratic. So there's lesson to be learned for Republicans of how do you reach voters who may not always be with you by being on the platforms where they are.
Yeah. And with this cycle over cycle data, it is giving us this trend line. And obviously, anytime there's a significant jump, like we saw with TikTok, it's worth taking notice. And so in the immediate days following Trump's victory this year, there was a lot of focus on the role of podcasts, how Trump did more podcasts than Kamala Harris. I was a little skeptical because back in 2020, we saw that only 10% of voters said they listened to podcasts on a weekly basis. Then we got this year's data back, and now 32% of voters are listening to podcasts each week. And so that's triple in just 4 years. Dave, where does that put podcasts in terms of other news sources for voters?
Basically, podcasts are now the equivalent of cable news channels. We saw 32% use podcasts for news each week. And just for comparison, 35% of voters report watching Fox News at least once a week, 33% reporting watching CNN once a week, and 26% say they watch MSNBC on a weekly basis. And if we want another comparison, talk radio was always really important to conservatives, since that's where folks like Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, and Ben Shapiro got their start before migrating into TV and other medium. And for comparison, just a quarter of voters listen to talk radio each week, while it's a third of voters who now listen to podcasts each week. Even among Republican voters, podcasts are basically equal to talk radio in terms of reach. And while the talk radio audience leans Republican, podcasting is something that reaches voters across party lines. Around 1/3 of Republicans, independents, and Democrats listen to podcasts. The other thing we're seeing is that podcasts can be part of the infotainment media ecosystem, where people are looking to be entertained and get some news as a part of that entertainment. This was the first cycle we've asked it, but we also saw that 30% of voters reported watching a comedy program like The Daily Show or The Tonight Show at least once a week. And that's right in line where podcasts are. And podcasts can be a little bit like that. It's not necessarily just the people who listen to Pod Save America or Tucker Carlson. Those can be good audiences to reach potential donors, but it's about reaching the people who aren't watching local news, but instead may pick up what's happening in the world by listening to The Breakfast Club with Charlamagne tha God or Joe Rogan.
You're listening to the Campaign Trend Podcast. David Kanevsky and I are breaking down some key findings from the Center for Campaign Innovation's 2024 post-election survey, Let's shift now to some data about how campaigns are reaching out to voters. Another area where we're seeing growth trends is in how voters are researching elections and the candidates on their ballots. So 60% of voters said they used a search engine like Google to find political information. That's a 16-point jump from 2020. Campaign websites are still important too, with 31% of voters visiting one. Dave, the thing that was surprising to me is that it's not 100% because personally, my instinct is always to Google. But what's driving this growth?
Well, there's definitely a generational aspect to it. Among voters age 18 to 34, 80% are searching online to find out about candidates. But among seniors age 65 plus, just 50% are. Similarly, 49% of voters age 18 to 34 are going to a candidate's website, while just 20% of seniors are visiting a candidate's website. So as younger voters who have grown up with the internet their whole lives become a larger share of the electorate, we'll see further growth in terms of search and digital. And also just keep in mind, politics and campaigns aren't at the forefront of voters' everyday lives. You mentioned that a quarter of voters are news avoiders, and we see that those voters are less likely to search online or go to a candidate's website. So, people may be searching for other things, but not necessarily searching for politics. But what I would think would surprise your audience is that the people who are most likely to go to a candidate's website or search online are actually the least likely to vote. People have voted in 0 or 1 of the last 4 elections. Now, some of that is because the people who aren't frequent voters do tend to be a little bit younger, but some of it is because the voters who are the most persuadable, the most likely to, decide, do I vote Republican or Democrat, and kind of switch between, split their ticket. Those are actually the least likely to vote in terms of their vote history. If you always vote in primaries or you always vote in general elections, you're more likely to have strong views on issues and candidates. And so you don't need to go search online because you kind of know where you're standing before that. But it's the people who don't always vote that are turning more to digital to find out information. Those voters tend to be less tuned into politics. So when there's an election happening, they go online to find out about candidates, especially their local candidates that might not get as much earned media attention. And that's where they turn to online to find out about these candidates.
So what we're starting to get is this picture of a, bifurcated electorate. We're going to have to come up with a better name for it. So you've got half of the voters are paying attention. They're probably more civically engaged. They're watching the news. They've got strong opinions. And then you've got the other half of the electorate who aren't reading the news. They're not maybe as engaged in their local community, but they still come out and vote, especially when someone like President Trump is on the ballot and increases turnout. That is, just like making it harder for campaigns, I would have to imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. You've got to kind of reach voters where they are, again, whether it's podcasts, the infotainment space, things like that. Not just the people who come to politics, but the people who you have to make politics come to them. Last thing I'd add about kind of what is it people are going online for? It's not always how campaigns are using digital. So we've asked this question, if you search online or if you go to a candidate's website, what are you looking for? And we've asked this every cycle since 2020. And the top answer has always been the same. It's to find out about the candidate's stance on issues. Even among donors, the people who go to a candidate's website to donate, it ranks 4th as why you're going online, behind finding out about the candidate's stance on issues, finding out news about the candidate, and finding out about the candidate's bio. So donations are further down the funnel. But you often see campaigns spend a lot of time and money optimizing to get visitors to a website into the donation funnel by, playing with the colors and placement of donation button, optimizing search for Act Blue or Win Red pages. And while that's important, I'd say it's more important for campaigns to optimize their websites for persuasion around issue pages. And a good example of this is if you look at the presidential primaries this year, some candidates starting using AI to create chatbots to answer voters' questions. And I think there's an opportunity to try to do something similar for down ballot candidates. So voters can find out not only where their down ballot candidates stand around, these big issues like taxes and spending or abortion, but maybe some of these issues that are still very important to voters, but kind of lower salience or not as important to voters broadly, issues like daylight savings time, crypto, or animal welfare issues.
Again, it kind of counters my previous assumptions that campaign websites were really for your hardcore partisans or your supporters, and they were going there just to check you out. But those aren't they may be going there, especially early on in a primary process. But, once we move to the general election, it's this researcher, the sort of voter who doesn't come with a partisan alliance out of the gate, or maybe they're not as frequent a voter. And it really does highlight how campaigns have to be having kind of two different conversations with two different types or halves of the electorate. Another sign of the digitization of political campaigning having already happened comes from texting and digital ads. So we found that in 2024, texting reached more voters than phone calls, and more voters saw digital ads than received direct mail. So 67% of voters said they received text messages from campaigns compared to 38% who reported getting phone calls. So just 4 years ago, when we started doing this poll, they were roughly tied at 50-48. Dave, what's driving the shift? Is it changing demographics again, or is it the diffusion of digital tactics, or some combination of all of the above?
I think it's some combination, and it's really about reaching voters where they are in the most cost-effective manner. So 4 years ago, 44% of voters reported that they had a landline phone. But this year, just 26% of voters report having a landline phone. But 94% of voters have a smartphone. So, yeah, we can call them on their smartphone, but we know, not everyone will pick up a call, listen to their voicemail. So, texting is a good way to reach them. Another part is campaigns are just being more cost effective with their dollars. So, for example, when I was political director at the RSLC and we were trying to figure out how to allocate our spending in races, a mailer might cost 50 cents per piece when you add in printing and postage, but a text message would cost less than 1/5 of that. So for the same cost of sending one mail piece, we could send 5 text messages. Now, at the RSLC, we still send direct mail, but we integrated texting into it. So if you had a cell phone appended on the voter file, you got fewer mail pieces and more texts. But if you didn't have a cell phone appended, then we'd send you more mail to reach you in the most cost-effective manner for each voter. I do worry that as texting has become more common and cheaper, and not just for politics, that campaigns are oversaturating it. Text messaging has gone from being the next great thing to potentially being the equivalent of a robocall, something that's so cheap that every campaign does it, and then messages can get lost in the clutter. So another question we started asking this cycle was whether voters with smartphones have a spam filtering app. And what we found that 1 in 5 voters and 1 in 3 donors have those spam filtering apps for text and phone calls. And then those voters with these spam filtering apps are pretty heterogeneous, and they're reflective of the overall electorate. That it's not just younger voters or seniors who are adopting these to filter out unwanted calls or text messages. And you also look at tech companies and telecoms who are adapting to this. You see Apple rolling out features that are going to allow you to filter out text messages from unknown centers. So campaign texts might start going to spam just like many emails do, especially as we see more stories around spam and phishing texts in the news, not just from campaigns, but from, people trying to steal your data. And that means campaigns are going to need to find new ways to reach voters if 1 in 5 of their texts are not actually reaching their target audience.
Yeah, it really does underscore just how much disruption is going on in this industry, specifically as it relates to technology and voter contact. That, when we find a lifeline like texting, it gets oversaturated. It gets kind of burned to the ground. There's also kind of this cat and mouse going on where people are trying to avoid it and block it. And so as these channels become oversaturated, we're always looking for new methods to reach voters. And relational organizing really is that next frontier. We found that 30% of voters said that someone they know encouraged them to vote for a candidate. So that is a 7-point increase since 2020. What do campaigns need to know about this trend of growth in relational organizing?
So simply put, when it comes to relational organizing, campaigns need to just do more of it. Yes, more voters were contacted by a friend or family member about a candidate than in 2020, but this is actually something where there's even more room for growth. So we asked not about politics, but did you ever buy a product or service because a friend or family recommended it? And we found 38% of voters say they bought a commercial product because of a personal recommendation. And so if voters are willing to go to a restaurant or hire a roofing company because their cousin or coworker recommended it, then we'd expect it to have a similar impact in politics. And I would say there's really 2 places where I think relational organizing has an ability to grow. The first is in primary. If you think about it, in primaries, most candidates are similar ideologically. In a GOP primary, usually all the candidates are going to be for lower taxes, less government spending, and pro-life to some degree. So if you're a campaign trying to figure out how to stand out in a crowded primary field, how do you do that? And that's where that recommendation from a friend or family member can be the thing that pushes the undecided primary voter over the edge to your campaign. The second place relational organizing can really help is in rural areas where door knocking isn't always as efficient because there isn't often enough density. If you have to walk, half a mile between doors, it's really tough to reach voters. So in urban areas, 34% of voters reported receiving a door knock. And in suburban areas, it was 29% of voters reported receiving a door knock from a campaign. But in rural areas, just 19% of voters reported receiving a door knock, and just 13% of voters in rural areas reported receiving a door knock from a Republican candidate or campaign. So given how much Republican candidates rely on running up the margins in rural areas these days, relational organizing can help fill the gap to reach the voters that GOP campaigns cannot reach through traditional door knocking efforts. And then finally, I mentioned how we're seeing voters block texts from unknown senders, or voters are cutting the cord and watching less news, so it's harder to reach them via traditional TV advertising. And that's where relational organizing can help. Maybe these voters aren't seeing your campaign's ads or getting your campaign's text, or they're not following the news, but they will respond when it's their friend from their church choir or their college buddy who's messaging them about a candidate or messaging them to make sure they turn out to vote.
Yeah, it's absolutely a really powerful psychological force and something that we're just going to see more campaigns turning to. Well, thanks to Dave Kanevsky for a great conversation. There's a link to the full article of our 10 key takeaways at campaigninnovation.org included in the show notes. If this episode made you smarter, taught you something, which it definitely did because it's brand new, fresh data, all we ask is that you share it with a friend or colleague. You look smarter in the process. More people learn about the podcast. It's a win-win all around. Remember to subscribe to the Campaign Trend podcast wherever you get your podcasts, and you'll never miss an episode that way. Visit our website at campaigntrend.com for even more. With that, I'll say thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.
The Campaign Trend podcast is produced by Advocacy Content Kitchen, a media production studio.